Hi everyone. So welcome to the first slide. Today's going to be a bit shorter than the other sessions because it's sort of just a brief introduction and overview. I'm probably not going to, the other sessions might be 20 to 30 minutes, but I'm probably not going to talk more than 10, 15 minutes today because again, it's just an overview. And then I want to give you a chance to ask some questions and do a lot of discussion afterwards. Okay, so the subtitle asks who was Karl Marx, but actually I want to answer three basic questions today. And those are, okay, who was Karl Marx? And then secondly, what is Marxism? And then three, well, I guess also to justify, why does this matter? And, why is he still relevant and why is his philosophy still relevant? Okay, so here I have a picture of Marx. Well, Marx is on the left, and then his friend and colleague, Friedrich Engels, is on the right. And they were two German philosophers. They worked together on many books, most notably the Communist Manifesto. And they also worked in various political organizations and political parties. And together they developed some of the, cornerstones of what we would today call Marxism, relating to things like dialectics, historical materialism, class struggle, and so on. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details right now because we'll cover a lot of that in like the next two sessions. So it's going to be a bit hand wavy. So don't worry if you don't know exactly what these concepts mean. We will cover it. But anyway, they were active from the 1840s until about the early 1880s. So kind of in the middle to late 19th century. Engels lived about a decade longer, but Marx died in 1883. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Marx's life as well. So after completing his doctorate, Marx actually started out as a journalist and he wrote a bunch of newspaper articles. And the newspaper he wrote for in Prussia, I think, was called the Rheinische Zeitung. And it was eventually censored by the government and then outright banned. And actually, being censored and banned kind of became a feature of Marx's life in a funny way, because he was eventually exiled from his native Prussia because of his political views. And after that, he moved to Paris and he met Engels there for the first time in 1844, I think is the correct date. And he moved around a few more times, in his early life, partly because eventually he wasn't on good terms with the French authorities either. Again, because of his radical politics. And also there was a lot of political instability in Europe at the time. For example, if you know, like the history of 1848 with all the revolutions and so on, it wasn't always safe to be in certain places. But eventually he settled down in London, where I think he lived until for the rest of his life. He still traveled somewhat, but the reason he moved to London is because there was, more freedom of expression and so on. So Marx wrote a bunch of his early works in the 1840s, which are very important, of course. But then he realized after a while or he felt that his understanding of political economy, as it was called back then, or what we might just call economics today, and his understanding of how a capitalist economy works wasn't particularly good. So he spent the next 2 decades of his life working on his, sort of magnum opus, which is Capital, all three volumes here. And that's his, critique of all the, capitalist economists and him sort of creating his own system there, if you like. And then the first volume of Capital, I believe, was published in 1867. And well, he didn't fully complete his work on Capital. Volume 3 is somewhat incomplete. But after finishing most of the work on Capital, Marx returned to political life. And he then became one of the leading members of an organization called the International Working Men's Association, which is also called the First International. And if you know like about socialist history after Marx, then you'll know there are like multiple internationals. Like Trotsky had the Fourth International. There was the Second International, which sort of collapsed in the start of the 20th century, and so on. But what's notable about the First International is, well, firstly, they became relatively influential in some working class movements. But also, what we study it for today is mostly the arguments between intellectuals within the First International, Marx being one of them. And the main split in the First International was between the anarchists and the Marxists. Most notably on the anarchist side was Mikhail Bakunin, and Marx and Engels had some very horrible things to say about him, and they wrote all kinds of horrible polemics against each other. So yeah, like sectarianism and leftist infighting is not a new thing. It's been around for 150 years or so. Okay, so hopefully that was a good short biography. I hope so, at least.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about why I think Marx is still relevant and why he still matters. So for this purpose, I'm going to draw a bit on Walter Rodney's 1975 speech, Marxism and African Liberation, which I highly recommend you read. And in that speech, he gives two reasons why he thinks Marxism is relevant to, well, basically any society, but particularly African societies. And those two reasons are, he says, you need to look at Marxism as a methodology, firstly, but also as a revolutionary ideology. So I'll get into what he means by that. But let me just start by, just reading a quote from that speech. So he says, the first is to look at Marxism as a methodology, because a methodology would, virtually by definition, be independent of time and place. You will use the methodology at any given time, at any given place. You may get different results, of course, but the methodology itself would be independent of time and place. So this is, he kind of repeats himself there, but it's actually a very important point. Marxism isn't an abstract set of beliefs that, Karl Marx just sort of imagined one day in the 1840s. And it's not a dogma. It's not like I say, it's not a doctrine that you can just apply universally to all societies at all times in the same way. And in fact, as we'll learn when we talk later about dialectics and historical materialism, that this dogmatic way of thinking is actually very anti-Marxist in some ways. So instead, I think we should view it as Rodney does, as a way of orienting our understanding of society. And so that Marxist methodology, which we're going to be learning about, can basically be applied to any society, but we'll get different results based on the specific features of each society. So Rodney continues a little bit later, and he says, I would suggest then that the method was independent of time and place. It is implicit in Marx, and it becomes explicit in post-Marxian development, using Marxian in the literal sense of the life of Marx himself. After Marx's death, you will get the evolution or the development of scientific socialist thought, with other individuals recognizing that the methodology must be applied to different times, to different places. So I think that last bit of the quote I read is really important, is that subsequent thinkers need to reach further conclusions than Marx was able to in his lifetime. They need to build on his body of work. And that analysis that they're adding to it, has to be based on the conditions of the society in which those thinkers live, right? So Rodney later in his speech brings up the example of Lenin, who recognized that capitalism had developed into a new stage towards the end of the 19th/start of the 20th century, which is the stage of imperialism. So he writes about that in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, right? And he adjusts his analysis to account for imperialism. But of course, a large part of Lenin's body of work is also analysis of Russian conditions leading up to the Russian Revolution, right? And correct analysis is what helped him to actually successfully lead that revolution. And the same goes for, say, the Cuban Revolution. You need to do an analysis of the conditions in Cuba, or so understanding South African politics in 2021 or almost 2022, you need to do an analysis of the conditions in South Africa. Now, me personally, I would argue that Marxism is also relevant today because, ultimately we still live in a capitalist society. So, of course, society has changed a lot since Marx's time, but there are still classes, we still have social production and private accumulation of capital, and so on. So Marx's insights into those things, which, we'll talk about later, and, Marx's critiques of those things still, they remain valuable to this day. And as Rodney points out as well, that capitalist system which Marx was critiquing in Europe and which was kind of, originating at that time, in 1848, several countries had their, quote, capitalist revolutions or bourgeois revolutions. But that system which he was critiquing in Europe in the 19th century through imperialism, colonialism, etc., has since spread across the world. And of course, we see it today in Africa and in South Africa. So, just to read another quote from Rodney here. He says, even without the translation in terms of time and place, it seems to me that if we have become part of the capitalist imperialist world, then we owe it to ourselves to relate to follow, to understand, and to hopefully adopt and adapt a critique of that capitalist system, because that is essentially what Marx's writing is about. He was critiquing that capitalist system. He did so more effectively than any bourgeois writer, and if we want to understand the world in which we live, which is the world dominated by capitalism, then we must understand the center of that system, the motor within that system, the types of exploitation which are to be found within the capitalist mode of production. So yeah, I think that really gets to the heart of it. And if you're into sort of leftist politics, then hopefully you're standing against all forms of oppression, exploitation, unjustified hierarchies, and so on. And yeah, I mean, you have to orient your understanding of that with a critique of capitalism as well, because that's a form of exploitation. So as I mentioned earlier, Rodney also sees Marxism as a revolutionary ideology, but one that also comes from a class perspective. So Marxism grounds itself in the perspective of the subjugated class under capitalism, the proletariat, right? I mean, if you read Capital, then you'll notice that Marx is often talking about things from a proletariat perspective, a working class perspective. And again, like I said, if you stand up for the poorest and most oppressed people, then that would be the working class, the class that's subjugated under capitalism. So he says, and I'll just end with this quote basically. He says, nevertheless, by and large, we could see Marxism and scientific socialism as subversive of, and antithetical to the maintenance of the system of production in which we live. Because ideas, let me repeat, do not float in the sky. They do not float in the atmosphere. They are related to concrete relations of production. Bourgeois ideas derive from bourgeois relations of production. They are intended to conserve and maintain those relations of production, i.e., they're maintaining the existing hierarchies. Socialist ideas derive from the same production, but they derive from a different class interest, and their aim is to overthrow that system of production. So yeah, I think those last few sentences put it really, succinctly. That's all I'll say for now. So if you have any questions, we can maybe do some discussion.